Chapter 4, The Birth of the American Republic. Part 3, The Final Design. Section 1, The Process of Coming to an Agreement. A note of caution here. It is extremely important to note that the delegates who gathered in Philadelphia to devise a new political formula for the purpose of closer political union among the 13 states were not, like the French, inexperienced in Republican self-government. Not only had Americans been operating for years under the Confederation government, but the states these delegates represented had already put into effect their own constitutions as independent states. Thus, each of them had a pretty good idea of what American government was to look like, at least in principle. Indeed, the Americans had been practicing some form or other of constitutional self-government since their ancestors put England behind them in coming to America some century and a half earlier. The royal charters of the 1600s that birthed each of the American colonies were themselves constitutions of sorts, describing precisely the purposes and practices that the colonies were to live by. Thus, it is important to note that these founding fathers were not inventing self-government. They already understood quite well the principles involved in effective self-government. Rather, they were trying to figure out the formula for a collective self-government that would allow them to continue to work together as a union at a higher level than each independent state. They were not naive like the French and like many Americans today, believing that some utopian formula discovered by some political genius among them was what they needed. Rather, they knew that each delegate that gathered there had a somewhat different political agenda he would be pursuing, and they were going to have to work together in full respect of those different agendas or interests, if together they were going to find the necessary common ground on which to build a new union government. With the benefit of considerable political experience, and with God's counsel opening their hearts to each other, they would succeed. In short, American government itself was not birthed in 1787, as we so often tend to imply when we talk about the birth of the Republic that year. Actually, long-standing traditions in American government were simply adjusted to meet the ever clearer needs for a more effective union among the 13 newly independent states. Divergent interests. By no means did the 55 delegates who gathered in Philadelphia at the end of May in 1787 have the same idea, some widely agreed upon logic as to what was supposed to result from their work. They represented not only a wide array of states, big and small, but also different lifestyles, major plantation owners, prosperous urban tradesmen, lawyers, etc. The states they represented also found themselves in deep contention about how exactly their western borders extended to the west beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And most important, they held very different ideas about what kind of government reforms they wanted to see take place. Federalists and anti-federalists. Some, like Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, were strong nationalists or federalists who were hoping to see a much stronger political hand holding the 13 states together. But others who came to Philadelphia were of the opposite opinion. They thus strongly anti-federalist, fearing that just such a political union would usurp the very freedoms that they had so recently fought to secure against the ambitions of the English King George III. In fact, major figures of the recent War of Independence, such as Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry, had refused to participate, fearing that the convention would saddle them with just such a government. Likewise, the tiny state of Rhode Island didn't even bother to send participants to the meeting, fearing the loss of their independence to the interests of the larger states such as Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. The Virginia Plan. Almost immediately upon arrival to Philadelphia did the delegates set aside the idea of merely amending the Articles of Confederation. Indeed, James Madison had busied himself in drafting up a proposal before the convention had even convened. His proposal set out some basic principles which pointed to a national government with a number of strong powers, which his own Virginia delegation and the Pennsylvania delegation were quick to agree on, thus giving it considerable weight. Indeed, his Virginia plan was put forward at the convention as the opening document, calling up countering documents, or at least offering itself as a document to which amendments and details could then be added. His Virginia plan provided for a bicameral legislature of two separate bodies, an upper and a lower house, on the order of the English Parliament, with its House of Lords and House of Commons, a principle followed as well in the design of the governments of most of the individual states. In this, it departed from the Confederation Congress's single or unicameral assembly, which had demonstrated how a unicameral legislature tended to be easily susceptible to the swings of political mood which accompanied popular politics, that is, politics of the people. The hope was that a second legislative body could counterbalance the passions of a popular assembly because, like the English House of Lords, the second body would be expected to be made up of a smaller group of more distinguished statesmen. However that group might be chosen was left open as a key question. Also, Madison's Virginia plan provided for a stronger, more independent executive, not quite like a king, but stronger than the executives of the Confederation and many of the states, who were largely dependent on the legislative bodies for their powers, and thus lacking in any significant power to direct and lead the nation. Anyway, most of the delegates were expecting Washington to head up the new government, and it was important to assign him sufficient powers and independence of action to bring his talents to full service to the country. But the question remained, was he to be the sole executive and thus more like a king, or was he to share his function with one or two others, as was done anciently? What would be his term of service? Serving for life, and thus indeed like a king, or elected and probably re-elected annually or for periods of greater length? And there was the matter of the judiciary, or body of judges, who, by English tradition, were extensions of the king's authority. Efforts of the states to make their judges instead dependent on the appointive powers of the legislatures had produced less than distinguished judges and elements of well-known political corruption. How such judges should be selected was thus a major problem that brought on much debate. The debate begins. The first issue to come under heated debate was the selection of the representatives to the new Congress. The Virginia plan assumed that representation in Congress, both upper and lower houses, would be on the basis of the number of voters in each state, which would clearly give the bigger states a dominant voice in the new government. But Virginia seemed to be willing to listen to some kind of compromise that would bring the states together in their thinking. The New Jersey plan. The smaller states were hoping for equal representation among the states, irrespective of size. Representing the interests of the smaller states, the New Jersey delegates thus offered a counter-proposal to the Virginia plan, which called for the continuing existence of the Continental Congress as a single unicameral body, with each member state holding equal representation despite the size, large or small, of each state. Footnote. Continental Congress, which had guided the 13 states during the War of Independence, had given each state simply a single vote, regardless of the number of individuals, usually 2 to 6 or 7 a state had representing it in Congress. End of footnote. But it would be given new powers, such as in the collecting of taxes and the power to override the state laws. This gave the smaller states a rallying point to put forward their political interests. But overall, it was an idea that the larger states clearly were unwilling to accept. The Connecticut, or Great Compromise. Roger Sherman of Connecticut came forward with the idea in support of the Virginia plan's call for a bicameral Congress, but with one chamber, the House of Representatives, giving the states representation on the basis of the relative size of their population, but the second chamber, the Senate, giving each of the states equal representation as per the interests of the smaller states. At first, Sherman's idea was rejected, as the states, large and small, were holding out protection of their respective political interests. Footnote. It was at this point that Franklin asked the convention to bring God into its deliberations as a means of transcending their deep differences. End of footnote. Also, there were other issues that undermined the spirit of compromise necessary to break the political impasse. Slavery. One of the issues that would long stir turmoil in the new republic was this matter of slavery. Almost half of the delegates to the convention and all of the Virginia and South Carolina delegates were slave owners. But in general, Northerners tended to be adamantly opposed to the idea and practice of slavery. Indeed, many of the northern states had included a total prohibition of slavery in their new state constitutions. But Southerners could not bring themselves to imagine seriously a Southern economy able to function without slavery. Some made it clear that they would not join the new Union if slavery were somehow disallowed. Moreover, the Southern states were adamant on the matter of including their slaves in the calculation of the representation in the House of Representatives. But Northerners were quick to point out that slaves weren't citizens. Thus, should they be counted at all? Footnote. Indians were never part of the count. End of footnote. Some Northerners even quipped that since slaves had merely the status of property, rather than a free citizen, Northern cattle should also be added to the count for the Northern representation in the House of Representatives. Ultimately, another compromise was eventually reached when it was decided that slaves should count as 3/5 of a person. Anyway, most of the Southern framers were of the opinion that slavery would soon die a natural death, though they had no idea of how that might happen. And so they basically dodged the issue and would continue to do so until it blew up in their faces in the early 1860s. Part 2. A federation replaces the confederation. What the framers ultimately came up with as they concluded their work in mid-September was a central or federal political authority with just enough power to keep the states working together in a sense of American unity, but with enough limits to its power to ensure that it would not fall into the human sin of unchecked power hunger that led inevitably to tyranny. The Congress, or the legislative branch of the federal government. In a sense, what they had finally agreed on was a new treaty of political alliance among the 13 independent states. Footnote. As stated previously, Rhode Island did not send a delegation to participate in the drafting of a new constitution. However, Rhode Island did finally join the Union in 1790. End of footnote. This was to be a treaty stronger than the one that had empowered the Confederation. This new treaty instead provided for a federation, meaning a political union with strong powers, though only in certain carefully prescribed areas of government, assigned to a central authority by the still quite strong individual state governments that made up the Union. The heart of the Federation was to be a newly empowered Congress, one with wider powers than the older Continental Congress, which would meet periodically to enact certain categories of legislation for the Union. This Congress, as per the Connecticut Compromise, was to be made up of two separate assemblies, with the lower house, the House of Representatives, representing the American people directly, elected by them, and thus giving the new federal union something of a democratic quality. But the upper house, the Senate, would represent instead the states, each of the participating states being permitted to select and send two of its most respected statesmen to Congress to give direct voice to the interests of their respective states. Also, the Senate was supposed to be something of a more aristocratic assembly, a council of political dignitaries who were to keep cooler political heads than what might be expected of the representatives of the people in the House of Representatives. Footnote. However, the Senate was democratized in 1913 with the passing of the 17th Amendment, having the voters of each state, rather than the state assemblies, select their two senators. End of footnote. But in any case, Congress would be able to function only as both the House and the Senate work together. The President, or the executive branch. Congress was intended to be the political center of the whole system, a place where representatives of the states and the American people themselves might gather to do the business of the Union. But the Constitution provided also for an executive officer, a president, whose primary job was to oversee the ongoing unity of these United States. He was to be no king, but only a political supervisor, elected for a term of 4 years, presumably renewable, however. He was given a key leadership duty in being the one to call Congress into legislative session, even call special sessions of Congress if need be, and to report to Congress on his observations as to the state of the Union. He was expected to be the enforcer, that is, the one assigned the task of seeing that the laws passed by Congress were indeed faithfully executed or followed throughout the Union. In short, he was seen primarily as an executor of Congress's legislation, though possessing a limited veto or blocking power if he deemed such legislation inappropriate to the health of the Union. He did have additional functions that fell to him alone, such as sending and receiving diplomats, symbolizing the majesty of the United States, and along those same lines was given the responsibility of overseeing the country's relations with other countries. He was also given the responsibility of serving as the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, a vital role in the follow-up to his foreign policy responsibilities, although he could not actually employ this military except when specifically authorized to do so by the Congress. And also, as Congress met only periodically, he and his cabinet staff were given the task of the ongoing day-to-day administration of the federal system at the all-union or national level. Footnote. It would be wrong to characterize the United States as a nation at this point. Certainly, citizens had some kind of collective or national identity as Americans, but that sentiment would develop in depth only later. At the moment, they still saw themselves primarily as New Yorkers, Virginians, Georgians, etc. End of footnote. The Supreme Court, or the judicial branch. The Constitution also described a Supreme Court of federal judges, largely expected to act in accordance with the British legal tradition in seeing to the fair application of the laws of the legislature, that is, Congress. The judges would be appointed by the President, but be able to take office only after a confirming vote by the Senate. At the time, it was anticipated that the federal judges would be involved mostly in issues arising largely around this tricky matter of the relationship among the different states of the Union. The limited powers of the central or federal government. There was only a very limited internal governmental role anticipated for the newly created Congress, President, and Supreme Court. It was understood that the principal concern of Congress would be in those matters concerning foreign civil and military relations with the outside world. Everything else, in particular all domestic matters, were considered as falling within the jurisdiction of the individual states. There were some domestic responsibilities assigned to Congress. It had a number of financial powers, such as creating its own tax source, establishing and regulating and protecting a national coinage or currency, borrowing on credit, standardizing the rules of bankruptcy throughout the United States. Congress could establish a union-wide postal service and post roads. It was to encourage the development of science and the arts through standardizing weights and measures and creating uniform copyright or trademark protections. It was to create uniform rules by which people could attain citizenship, that is, naturalization. The most interventionist of the clauses of the Constitution in the domestic affairs of the Union was the power assigned to Congress to regulate commerce among the states, the so-called Interstate Commerce Clause. But interstate commerce was seen simply as the issue of the states raising trade barrier protections against each other, a practice the Constitution was designed to bring to an end. It was not intended as an open door for Congress or the President or the Supreme Court to become involved in the internal affairs of America. The residual powers of the states in the federal system. So, with the exception of the specifically named powers of Congress to act on domestic issues, the states were still left with the larger task of continuing to provide the people domestic government, that is, government inside the Union itself. A republic rather than a democracy. No mention of democracy. It is important to note that the word democracy never appeared in the Constitution. The Constitution did define the political nature of this new political order as being republican, very specifically stating that any new states eventually joining the Union — Kentucky stood at the door expecting to become part of the Union at that very point — must be republican in character. The republican character of the Union was a matter that Congress itself was importantly to look after. The rule of law, rather than personal or even popular will. To the framers, democracy, as much as monarchy or aristocracy, implied the rule of the human will, whether the will of the many, of only one, or of a special few. The framers understood that any form of government directed by the will of human agents, however many or however few, was as easily susceptible to tyranny. Rather, the framers were looking for the rule of law, concrete principles that could be etched into stone or inscribed in bronze, as they anciently had been in the Roman Forum, principles that would stand for all times for the community. Humans and their personal desires would come and go, but laws carefully enacted through the constitutional directives they were putting into effect would not be easily swayed by changing human desires and fancies. No, the new government would be a government not of men, but of laws. The Romans had constructed such a political system. They too had believed, in accordance with the ancient Romans' typical love of order over impulse, that a government should be a system of laws, not personal wills. The framers agreed strongly with this same principle. Their hope was that, unlike the Romans who failed to hold to this fundamental principle, Americans would remain vigilant in maintaining the idea of government as a regime of laws rather than human wills. This was the central idea directing the deliberations of the framers of the Constitution that summer of 1787. They would create a republic. But the question still remained. Would the American people be able to keep this republic any better than had the Romans? Section 3, a government that draws its rights from the people, not vice versa. further securing the rights of the people against the governmental tyranny through the addition of 10 amendments. Not surprisingly, the final draft of the Constitution the framers put together still left unresolved considerable concern among some Americans about the dangers of potential tyranny in this new system. Consequently, in order to win over the reluctance of such anti-federalist or states' rights people as Jefferson and other prominent Virginians, a promise was made by the framers that the Constitution would be immediately amended upon taking effect to include a number of additional constitutional articles, further guaranteeing American freedoms against this new government, or something we know today as our Bill of Rights. Prominent among these guarantees is the very first of these amendments. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or preventing the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This amendment concerning the people's right to worship, speak, read, peaceably gather, and petition their government was placed in the prominent position as the First Amendment to the Constitution, emphasizing the guarantee that the new federal state would not infringe on the personal rights of Americans, rights that Americans had become accustomed to and certainly demanded of any government that they would allow. Footnote. Note that the First Amendment makes no mention of separation of church and state, which has become, by way of Thomas Jefferson, to be understood today as meaning that religion may not be practiced within the state, such as prayers at public events or within public institutions. Actually, it clearly meant that the state had no business regulating the practice of religion, which it does extensively today, via the federal courts, which have described in detail exactly when and where religion could be practiced legally. The courts have not moved to regulate speech in the press, so far anyway, only religion, in clear violation of the intent of the First Amendment. The Second and Third Amendments concerned respectively the rights of the people to keep and bear arms, and the forbidding of the stationing of troops in people's homes without their consent. The Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, and Eighth Amendments concerned the rights of the people to the official process of an arrest, trial, and sentencing. And the Ninth and Tenth Amendments made it clear that the states and the people retain full rights on all matters not specifically assigned by the Constitution to the central government. Quoting, "The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. The powers not delegated to the states by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." That's the Ninth and the 10th Amendments. These last two amendments were extremely critical in promising that other than the powers specifically described in the constitutional document as accorded to the central or national branches of the Federation, all other powers of government would remain reserved entirely as the privilege and responsibility of the states or of the people themselves. The question nonetheless remained: would such constitutional guarantees be sufficient to hold back the tendency of a government to want to expand its powers of control over the people? This was very much a part of the great political question that had bothered philosophers since ancient times. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Latin for who or what will govern those who govern. Will the people control their government, or will their government control them? Who will be sovereign, the people or their government? This matter of sovereignty. The issue of sovereignty, whether the states or the peoples, had weighed heavily over the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention. The word sovereignty meant rule over. According to long-established European political custom, the sovereign was the king. The king ruled over his subjects. The people literally lived and functioned at his tolerance and under his direction. French King Louis XIV, 1643 to 1715, had perfected this idea in France. The king rightly should enjoy the total or despotic powers over the people, because he would be expected to be the most enlightened member of the community, and therefore in the best position to know what was right for the community he ruled over. This idea was then quickly picked up by other European kings, including, a century later, the English King George III. This piece of royalist logic did not sit well with the American subjects of the English king. For a century and a half since they left England and crossed the great ocean to start life anew in America, they had needed no king to do their thinking for them. For that century and a half, they had been left alone to rule themselves. Families and local communities managed their own affairs on a daily basis, and on special occasions when there was a need to do some colony-wide business, they would elect representatives to be their voice in the management of the larger affairs of the colony. They had done just fine as self-sovereigns and resented it immensely, finally to the point of rebellion, when George III and his Tory supporters in Parliament attempted to bring these free peoples under tight royal control. The people's divine rights. Lingering behind this debate was the question of political legitimacy. European kings founded or justified their despotic powers not just on the basis of enlightenment, for even commoners could bring themselves to enlightenment, but also on the basis of divine will. For over a century, European kings have been claiming that they enjoyed their sovereign position because of the desire of God himself that they should so rule. God, after all, caused them to be born to this position, so how could anyone question what God had decreed? European kings, as they saw the matter, thus ruled by divine right. But Americans not only had learned the art of self-rule through a century and a half of effective self-government, they too felt that they had done so as a legitimate matter, also of divine rights. They were Protestants, heavily shaped in their thinking by the Protestant reformer John Calvin of the mid-1500s. That was true especially of the Puritans or Congregationalists, the Scottish Presbyterians, and the Dutch Reformed, the German Reformed, and the French Huguenots communities in America. These Calvinists who had raised the idea that all people, kings and commoners, enjoyed equally important responsibilities before God, even though the roles they played in society were different. As the Apostle Paul pointed out in his letter to the Corinthians, though people are gifted in their service to the community differently, they are all equally important in the eyes of God and in the functioning of the community. Each person has a distinct calling, a vocation from God to play a key role in the life of the community. Each receives empowerment from God in the performance of his or her vocation. Each is equally responsible before God for the proper carrying out of that vocation. There's no room for laziness, no room for cheating, and no room for lording it over others, for God's justice is not to be mocked. Their ultimate accountability, therefore, is not to some human authority, but to God himself. Thus, when English King George III invoked divine rights in his attempt to bring the American colonies under his complete control, they answered with their own divine rights theory. Again, this is well stated in the opening paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Thomas Jefferson elaborated on this a few years later in his Notes on the State of Virginia in 1781. God, who gave us life, gave us liberty. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift from God, that they are not to be violated, but with his wrath. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and that his justice cannot sleep forever. So for those who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to work out the constitution of a new American government, the question of political sovereignty was clear. It belonged, by the will of God, to the people, or to them through the states, which through their elected representatives the sovereign people controlled with their right to vote. The rights of the American people did not and would never derive from the institution of some governing state, whether kingly or aristocratic or even bureaucratic, that is, professionals working full-time for the state. It belonged naturally by the will of their creator with the people themselves. The new federal government, with its carefully defined and limited authority, would function only as the sovereign American people should empower it, either directly through the House of Representatives or indirectly through the Senate, representing the states, whose own political officials were generally elected in whole or in part by the people. Protecting and preserving the sovereignty of the people. The people's rights, of course, are hard to hang on to, as the framers of the Constitution were well aware, having just fought a bitter battle against the English king and his armies to preserve their rights as Americans. What could possibly serve as some kind of guarantee that these rights would not be lost again, that some kind of tyranny of those who lust after political power would not eventually arise in America? They were quite familiar with the failure of Athens, Rome, and Israel in this regard. What could guarantee that this would not also happen to them? This is why Franklin answered the query as to what the constitutional architects had created, when he answered, "A republic, if you can keep it." Section 4. What were the guarantees that this would work? But all of them knew that the answer to that question, their sovereign rights, their personal freedoms, could be guaranteed by no living being, no matter how kindly disposed he might originally be. According to their Puritan understanding, man was by nature invariably a sinner. Given enough opportunity, power would corrupt any human heart. A mechanical system of checks and balances. Certainly, they had been careful to build into the government a system of checks and balances which would actually use human selfishness or political greed to good effect. The system was set up so that cooperation among a number of various branches of government would be required to make the system work, and cooperation meant compromise, the necessity of having to give up the desire for total power in order to employ any power at all. If one of the branches of government would start to assume more power for itself, which was, by the way, a rather certain possibility, this would stir the indignation of the other branches, which, out of a self-serving sense of the relative loss of their own power, would gang up on the usurper of their joint power. This was a very ingenious system. In God we trust. But by no means did they rely entirely or even mostly on this ingenious mechanical system. They were well aware, just as Franklin had stated, that this whole enterprise would succeed or fall on one issue, the will of God. They needed to stay closely in line with the will of God, who, after all, had given them the victory against royal tyranny in the first place. Otherwise, nothing, not even clever mechanics, would protect them from human evil. George Washington stated the case very clearly in the speech he addressed to the nation as he took office in 1789 as America's first president. Quote, "It would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplication to that Almighty Being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that his benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. We ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right, which heaven itself has ordained. End of quote. This was not mere political posturing, this appeal to God. It was very serious business, for it rested on a truth that recent experience had made very, very clear. This was not just religious platitude designed by Washington to comfort the people with an assurance that he was a proper church-going Christian, which he frequently was not. This was a testimony to the reality of politics that all of these quite astute practitioners of politics had come to understand at a very deep level. The American venture would not fail, as had Athens and Rome's and Israel's attempts at self-government, as long as it retained a very deep sense of connectedness to God and his hand on the affairs of man. Christian realism and the Christian covenant. In the end, what we will term as the philosophy which guided these framers of the American Constitution is Christian realism. This philosophy was founded on the understanding that man can be both an angel and a devil, prone to do good and prone to do evil. Man must be allowed enough opportunity to put into effect his ability to do the good, while at the same time be put under enough legal restraint to check him against his equal ability to do evil. Ultimately, only God could be counted on to do the truly good, but man and God could work together, with man operating under God's judgments, inspired by an awe of God and desire to please God, yet at the same time fearful of what might happen if he did not remember to obey God. Thus, the Constitution would work for the American society as long as Americans understood the rules and as long as Americans freely chose to keep this Constitution as a covenant with God. Anything else would fail. As Christians, the framers of the Constitution were well aware of the words of advice and warning that Moses gave Israel as it entered into the Promised Land. This is the very same verses that founding father John Winthrop had referenced in his 1630 sermon, just as the Puritans were about to embark to begin their great Puritan experiment. Thus I read from Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 6 to 20. Observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and revering him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with streams and pools of water, with springs flowing in the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce, and you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron, and you can dig copper out of the hills. When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I am giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant which he swore to your forefathers, as it is today. If you ever forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and worship and bow down to them, I testify against you today that you will surely be destroyed. Like the nations the Lord destroyed before you, so you will be destroyed for not obeying the Lord your God.